Governor's Hurricane Conference. And welcome to Palm Beach County, the best of everything. Please rise for the presentation of colors by the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department Honor Guard and the singing of our national anthem by Eiley Tatro, a student attending the Alexander Dreyfus School of the Arts. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fights o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that
And please, thank you, and please be seated. Well, our thanks go out to the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department Honor Guard, Ms. Tatro, and the Palm Beach County School District's Alexander Dreyfus School of the Arts. It's now my pleasure to introduce the President of the Governor's Hurricane Conference Board of Directors, Paul Womble, Director of Polk County Emergency Management and a representative of the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association.
This year, there we go. Hey, I'm almost as good as Craig now. Hey, thank you for the performance. We appreciate your support. Welcome, this is the 39th annual Governor's Hurricane Conference here in Palm Beach County. We're excited to see both familiar faces and many, many new faces as we gather here to learn, network, and share experiences after what was a rather active 2024 hurricane season. We have a rich tradition here in Florida of preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. But our scope of our conference has grown. We've got folks from 34 states, 7 countries. So welcome, whether you're here, right here in South Florida or as far away as Great Britain. We've had a great conference so far with our training sessions, and we are excited for what's to come the rest of the week through the conference. The GHC has 3 sponsoring organizations: the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association, the American Red Cross, and the National Weather Service. Each sponsoring organization holds 2 seats on our board of directors. The board spends time throughout the year in person and virtually weighing the business end of the conference that make impacts on what you see here this week. So we want to recognize each of the board members and thank them for their time, their support from their sponsoring organizations and their agencies. Again, I'm Paul Womble. I'm the Director of Emergency Management in Polk County and represent the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association. Miss Mary Blakeney, she's the board vice president. She's also the Director of Palm Beach County Emergency Management. She represents the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association. And oh, by the way, today's her birthday, so tell her happy birthday. When you see her in the halls, maybe buy her a drink later, whatever you feel the need, but happy birthday, Mary. Mr. Jack Morgan is our treasurer. He's a volunteer with the American Red Cross. Mr. Ryan Locke is the Division Director of State Relations for the American Red Cross. Ms. Felicia Bowser, she's our secretary, and she's the meteorologist in charge of the Tallahassee National Weather Service office. And Mr. Mike Coyne, he's the director of the southern region of the National Weather Service. We couldn't do what we do without our volunteers. That's super important. I want to talk about that for a minute. We have 3 standing committees that work throughout the year to do business of the conference. These are and all volunteers are not paid for their time, and we appreciate their support and their agency's support. The program committee, which is chaired by Lee Mayfield from Hagerty. The awards committee is chaired by Joe Bories, recently retired from Pinellas County Emergency Management. Joe, I'm jealous. And our audit committee is chaired by Jonathan Lord of Flagler County Emergency Management. Again, without these hard work of these volunteers and these committees, the conference would not be what it is. In addition to the board and committees, we have numerous other volunteers that make this week happen. Without their time and dedication, many of them for decades, we would not have the production that you see today. Today's ceremony, the AV, the technical, the music, is all, Rick is our chief producer, technical guy, and he does a lot. So that's just one example of how our volunteers make this conference happen. From room monitors, registration staff, AV, computer, and technology experts, certificate preparers, logistical volunteers, drivers, runners, and many more. We would also be remiss if we didn't stop to mention the tireless efforts of our executive director, Renee Daines. Where is Renee? She's somewhere? Oh, she's hiding. So, Renee's job is to keep us, everybody, on track. She worries throughout the year about all the little details that keep us moving in the right direction. Renee is most likely the person you've spoken with or correspondence with via email for all things related to your GHC experience. And Renee, we could not do this without you. So I'd like all of the volunteers, committee members, our board to please stand, and let's give them a round of applause. And again, without their dedication and service, the GHC would not be what it is, so thank you very much. Our theme for this year's conference is Enduring Together, Persevering with a Purpose. So we looked back on the 2024 hurricane season that asked a lot of our collective professions. Multiple hurricane landfalls within a short period of time required continued service to our communities, often with no break, and a blurred line between response and recovery. This put added pressure on emergency management, meteorologists, and all of our community stakeholders, demonstrating the importance of leaning on each other, collaboration of all levels and across all jurisdictions, supporting our team, and persevering with the goal of improving outcomes for those we serve. And I just got to our communities and our family, our businesses, our visitors, that's why we do what we do. We've got to keep our eye on the ball. Some days it feels like we miss that. Hurricane Debbie made landfall in the Big Bend as a Cat 1 hurricane on August 5th. Hurricane Helene struck the same area as a major Category 4 hurricane on September 26th. And then Milton came along as a Category 3 storm on October 9th. And then looking beyond Florida, especially we've got a lot of folks from outside of Florida, Hurricane Beryl, wind and flooding the Texas and Louisiana, and of course also the impact from Helene in western North Carolina and Tennessee. Our rural counties in the Big Bend of Florida again found themselves responding to hurricanes while recovering from previous storms. Our heavily populated coasts, especially along the west coast, Kathy Perkins and others that you'll hear from soon, received historic coastal and inland flooding, wind damage from Debbie, Helene, and Milton. If Hurricane Debbie and Helene, these impacts were felt far away from landfall, often hundreds of miles away. Storm surge levels from Hernando County south through Sarasota County were the highest that many have seen in our lifetime, flooding tens of thousands of structures along the coast and inland. The east coast of Florida, and here in southwest or southeast Florida specifically, saw significant tornado damage, while Milton was well offshore of the Florida west coast. This year's conference reflects on a comprehensive training and workshop experience, taking into account our very diverse responsibilities and disciplines. This year, the program committee has selected over 70 trainings and workshops, developed this informative general session to share lessons learned from 2024 and to better prepare us for the future. We also hope that everyone looks forward to the numerous networking opportunities this week. Emergency management is a team sport. Build those relationships, meet new friends. I met some new friends from Virginia last night. I don't know if you're in here. I still can't say your city name, but we welcome you to be here. We have to thank our corporate sponsors and our underwriters. You'll see some of the signage. You'll see that. We appreciate your support. Again, without that support, the conference is not the experience that it is, so thank you. We'd also want to thank our group of 167 exhibitors who are with us this week. The exhibit hall opens today at 10:30 through 6 p.m. and will be open again tomorrow at 8 a.m. We appreciate that support and hope the vendors and the attendees go see the vendors. They have a lot of great things to show off. Without their support and private sector support, we can't do what we do. They are all part of the team, so please stop in and see the vendors. So we know we had some circumstances outside of our direct control, which did lead to some state and federal partners unable to be here this year. We regret that. Some of those were last minute notices, but we were able to pivot. I was in a class from TX and they were willing to take on 15 additional students above what they normally do, so that just shows our ability to adapt. We appreciate that. The conference, the GHC, the future of GHC is bright. We've got the dates of the future conference here. And again, all the work, contributions will lead us into the future and many years to come with the Governor's Hurricane Conference here in Florida. And then lastly, this week allows us to reflect on the 2005, or even the 2004, but 2005 hurricane season. In 2005, hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma put our systems to the test. How many folks in the room, by a show of hands, were involved in the 2005 hurricane season here in Florida in some capacity? Not very many. All right, hands down. Put your hands up if you were not involved in the 2005 hurricane season here in Florida. Okay, thank you. Lots of new folks, new people entering our career field, and we hope this week will allow all of you share your experiences, the history, and best practices that bring us together and prepare us for what's to come. I bet we can all think of mentors who laid the foundation for us in decades past. Personally, that was David Cash, who was the first real outside the civil defense era emergency management director in Polk County, and Larry Gispert, who was the EM director in Hillsborough County. Their history, their strong leadership has got us to this point today, and as the future arrives, there's other leaders, and we will build upon that legacy. It's now my honor to introduce our General Session moderator, Steve Weigel, who will lead us through the rest of today's General Session. Steve is a meteorology veteran, serving as the chief meteorologist at WPTV right here in West Palm Beach. Steve has been a presence in South Florida for well over 2 decades, working closely with both the public and emergency management community to educate and provide life-saving information when it counts. Steve holds the CBM seal from the American Meteorological Society, the highest seal awarded to television meteorologists. His career highlights include 2004 Hurricane Francis, where he talked South Floridians through the storm for almost 67 hours straight. Then later, a month later, Hurricane Jeanne. And then a year later, it was a direct hit with Hurricane Wilma. Also memorable for Steve was the 2003 tornado that tore through South Florida. Every June for almost 2 decades, Steve has biked the 125 miles from Sebastian to Boca Raton for Steve's Ride for the Red Cross. He supports many other local charities and talks to tens of thousands of viewers each year about hurricane preparedness. Steve has also served on the board of the Palm Beach and Treasure Coast chapter of the American Red Cross, participated in past GHC workshops, and he's also a recipient of a previous Governor's Hurricane Conference Media Award. But please give a warm welcome to General Session moderator, Steve Weigel.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good? All right. Well, some years here, I suspect we're not sure what we'll cover in the past year because it's been fairly slow. That won't be a problem this year because last year was really unbelievable. It kind of reminds me of 2004 with Charlie, Francis, Jeanne, and Ivan, 4 hurricane landfalls. You know, exactly a year ago, I was on this stage. Kevin Guthrie was here. He was part of the panel. And he said, be prepared for an incredible hurricane season in Florida with multiple landfalls. And at the time I thought, that's going out on a limb. Well, not only did we have that, we had 2 storms that made landfall in less than 2 weeks on the west coast of Florida. So it was really an incredible year. I'm kind of part MC, part moderator. We got a lot of special guests with us today. We have 2 special guests that I'm going to introduce in a moment. And then we have our panel session. And Lee tells me that this is when they do the surveys after the conference, which we would like you to do again this year, that this usually comes out as one of the most talked about sessions of the entire week. Isn't that right, Lee? Yeah, so I hope you enjoy it. Our panel's guests, emergency management on the west coast of Florida, are going to talk about their experiences dealing with Debbie, but I think even more so Helene and Milton last year. And October 9th, I've been here almost 30 years. I will say October 9th last year was the craziest day, even on the east coast of Florida. I cover from Vero to Boca Raton, southeast Florida area. This is not Tornado Alley. We were covering EF2 and EF3 tornadoes starting at like 7 in the morning through the entire afternoon and evening. It was really a surreal day. And Milton was still a long way from making landfall, still in the Gulf of Mexico. So it was really, really a crazy year. All right, we want to talk to you a little bit about how you can follow us on social media this year. and engage us, and please, use the hashtags. I want to thank Palm Beach County's Public Affairs Department. They have a really multifaceted social media program, and we invite you to like us on Facebook at Florida GHC, follow us on X at Florida GHC. Also, monitor hashtag GHC2025, hashtag Enduring Together, and hashtag Persevering with Purpose. So add these hashtags to your post, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And make sure to download our interactive mobile app for the conference. You can download it free, the Apple Store, Google Play. Search for GHC2025, one word. And our mobile app is easy-to-use tool, many useful resources that'll help you easily navigate your way through the entire conference this week. We'd also like to send out a big thank you to Indelible Solutions for their sponsorship for the audio-visual systems here at the conference this week. We greatly appreciate your support too. All right, my first guest, and the first two guests that I'm going to introduce today, I've known for almost 30 years. It's going to be exciting to hear from them. Respected public servant with extensive leadership experience, Palm Beach County Mayor Maria Marino currently serves as the chair of both the Tourist Development Council and the Palmar Water Control District, vice chair of the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council and the Palm Beach Transportation Planning Agency. Maria also serves on the Board of Directors and Executive Committee for the Business Development Board and is a board member of the Loxahatchee River Coordinating Council. She is the immediate past chair of the Solid Waste Authority and a former board member of the 16 County Coalition for Lake Okeechobee. Mayor Marino has been recognized with numerous state and national honors, including the Women of Excellence Award from the National Foundation of Women Legislatures, the Presidential Advocacy Award from the Florida Association of Counties, the 2023 Leadership Excellence Award from Leadership Palm Beach County, and her 2024 induction into the Palm Beach County Sports Hall of Fame. Long list there. All right, come on up. Her steadfast leadership and commitment to public service continues to shape and strengthen Palm Beach County and beyond. So a warm welcome to Mayor Marino.
Well, good morning all, and thank you for being here. And since Paul stole half of my speech, I'm going to wing some of it I'm not. But on behalf of Palm Beach County, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Actually, I'd like to thank also a couple of members of the board. Greg Weiss is here today, and we have staff from Vice Mayor Baxter's office here today. My staff is also here, and also the great staff of Palm Beach County, whether it's our fire rescue, our police, our emergency management, public affairs. Thank you all for being here. You do a great job. I do appreciate it very much. And I wanted to give a shout out to Virginia Baker, our county administrator, who, after a long and award-winning career with Palm Beach County, has decided to retire. So, Virginia, you want to stand up and please give her a hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about Palm Beach County. We've been hosting you now for 9 years. We're going to host you again next year, and we are pleased to have you again. What you do for Palm Beach County, you have a huge economic impact, which is great when we need the money later for emergency management. So Palm Beach County attracts millions of tourists each year because of our great weather, our beaches, whether you want to go to baseball. We have 4 teams here that have spring training, major golf tournaments. We have 2 PGA Tour events that are here. We have tons of ecotourism, and just the amount of bed tax that this event generates, and also visitation in Palm Beach County. We have almost 10 million people that come and visit our county. And it's a huge industry. The tourism industry is like 92,000 employees, so we are very grateful for that. And it's funny, when you were talking about Hurricane Milton, do you all remember that picture of the house that had the dumpster on the top of it? You all had to have seen that. That was in my neighborhood. Those folks had moved into their house 6 days previous to that. Also, there was supposed to be a Publix that was going to open in 2 weeks, brand new. They had to totally demolished the building because of the tornadoes that came through Palm Beach County. Our emergency rescue folks did a tremendous job. I want to say thank you because you were on the ground immediately. And I know that this is hard work for you to be involved in an event that can be so devastating. So thank you for all of your patience when you do this and all of your understanding and the fact that you really reach out to folks to try to make them comfortable. That was not really what was here, but I just wanted to say thank you. You know, we do hope that we have a quiet season. Keeping my fingers crossed. I just want everybody to be prepared, have your kit. It was funny because I did one of these, what do I do during a hurricane? And let's see, I put all of my valuables in my dishwasher and then I lock and close my dishwasher. I make sure that I take all of the ice out of the ice dispenser and put it in a bowl in the freezer in case I lose power. And then this way it doesn't melt all over the food that's in there. I've already told my parents, who by the way are 90 and 93 and live with me, for some reason they believe you have to have a full refrigerator and also an overfull freezer. So I said to them just recently, we need to start eating the food in the freezer because if we have a hurricane and we lose power and for some reason the generator doesn't work, which I haven't turned it on in several years, so that's a crapshoot. But anyway, so I watch the food that's in your freezer. If you go out, get your ice, put it in your, I'm sorry, I'm doing an ad for Yeti. I apologize. But I got to tell you that between my Yeti cooler and my Coleman cooler, those two coolers, fabulous. The food stayed cold. But have a plan, and whatever it is, be safe. Luckily, I do have two rooms in the house that are hurricane-proof because I redid the house, so I have hurricane windows in those rooms, so my mom will hide in the closet in my side of the house. So, like just the other day, tornado watch. Okay, we're going in your closet. I'm like, Mom, we don't have to go in the closet. But anyway, be prepared. But wrapping it up, please, while you're here, and take some time to enjoy our beautiful county, our 47 miles of coastline, our 110 parks. I mean, our 147 golf courses. For those of you that don't know, I'm a professional golfer. That's what brought me to Florida in 1985. So I've been here for a lot of storms. And I have to say, we are wonderful. We respond. Our emergency management team go above and beyond, led by our county administrator, Virginia Baker. And I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking the time to try to learn more about what we can do, how we can be prepared. Have that kit. Make sure, by the way, go and test your generators. Like I said, mine hasn't been on in a long time, so I'm going to go and test it when I leave here. Actually, I need to have somebody help me with that because I don't know the combination of the gas and the oil to turn it on, but that's what my brother is for. So thank you all for being here. I hope you have a wonderful time. You learn a lot. Please fill out the surveys. Thank you to all the sponsors. Thank you to all the vendors. We couldn't do an event like this without them. So have a great day and a great week.
I shouldn't admit this, but the mayor is absolutely right. Check your generator. I came home in 2017, Hurricane Irma, and the power was out. It was like 4 a.m. The generator was running. I go in the house, turn on the fan, and the ceiling fan was going about as slow as it could go. And I discovered that the generator turned on, it just didn't work. So I went through about 3 days of no power and no AC. All right, our next guest, this is a real honor because usually I'm on the other side and listening to him. I'll go back. I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but I mentioned this to Phil just a few minutes ago. I've been at this conference for decades, and Dr. Bill Gray, who did the seasonal hurricane forecast, he's the godfather of seasonal hurricane forecasting. When he passed away, those were big shoes to fill. And I told Phil a few moments ago, you have just expanded so, it's really incredible what you do and expanded on what Dr. Gray started. So anyway, Now I'm going to introduce you, Phil. He is a senior research scientist at the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University, received his PhD in atmospheric science from CSU in 2007. Klotzbach worked in the Department of Atmospheric Science since 2000 and was the co-author of the Atlantic Basin Hurricane Forecast with Dr. William Gray through 2005. He became first author on the seasonal hurricane forecast in 2006. Klotzbach developed the 2-week forecast currently being issued during the peak months of hurricane season between August and October. He has authored over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Climate and Weather and Forecasting. Graduated from Bridgewater State with a BS in meteorology in 1999. After receiving his master's degree in 2002, he hiked the Appalachian Trail, I did not know this, from Georgia to Maine, 2,100 miles. Wow, impressive. He's also climbed, and I do know this, he's also climbed all 54 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. Did you bring, usually you start your presentation with a few photos of you hiking. Did you bring one today? No. Well, I have to go to Colorado in the summer. His photos are amazing. It's on the top of the mountain, just unbelievable. And he's completed 9 marathons and 6 ultra marathons. He's a very humble guy. And when we asked for an introduction, he said, just say, here's Phil, he's a hurricane geek. So a warm welcome for Dr. Phil Klotzbach.
You know, I like the walk-up music too. I think I've had Dust in the Wind before, but I do approve of that one. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to be talking with you about the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season, so what we just went through. On Friday, I'll be doing a session on the 2025 outlook for the season, because while last year was crazy, unfortunately hurricane season does come around. It doesn't give you any breaks. We're going to have another one, unfortunately, coming up here in just a couple of weeks. So let's dive right in and talk about the 2024 hurricane season. When I was here last year, we were talking about, it looks like an extremely busy season. All the kind of conditions that we look for that promote busy hurricane seasons were in place. A lot of this work going back to, Steve mentioned, the work of my mentor at CSU, Dr. Bill Gray. Hopefully some of you had a chance to meet him. Truly a giant in the field of tropical meteorology. And obviously 2024 really did hit the ground running. This is a satellite loop of Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic on record. At this point, it was a Category 4 hurricane about to slam into Grenada, caused a lot of damage there, then became a Category 5 hurricane, and we thought, oh boy, what we thought was going to happen is going to happen. It's going to be one for the record books. And the season was extremely busy. We ended up with a total of 18 named storms. Of those 18, 11 became hurricanes. Of those 11, 5 became major Category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Major hurricanes are hurricanes with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. And while they only make up about 20-25% of the storms in any particular year, they do about 80-85% of the damage. We also have another index that we monitor that's called accumulated cyclone energy. That's a geeky metric that accounts for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. So it weighs strong, long-lived hurricanes very, very heavily. So a storm like Beryl that formed east of the islands, went all the way through the Caribbean, ended up hitting Texas as a strong storm. Those are the storms that generate a lot of ACE. If you're a baseball fan, you consider it as kind of the OPS of hurricanes. If you look at these statistics relative to average, you see that the major hurricanes have a higher percentage relative to normal than, say, the number of named storms. Last year was more of a, unfortunately, quality season than quantity season. We had a lot of storms, but especially a lot of these major hurricanes. And if we look at the tracks of the storms, there wasn't a lot going on in the Eastern Atlantic, and the strong storms that formed in the Eastern Atlantic did so very late. Our strongest storms in the East Atlantic, Kirk and Leslie, formed late in the season, late in September and in early October. But unfortunately, you see a whole pile of tracks in the Western Atlantic, and we're going to spend more time talking about the continental U.S. hurricane landfalls, but also wanted to highlight the Caribbean also had a very busy season. As I mentioned before, we had Hurricane Beryl causing a lot of damage in Grenada up through St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then caused additional damage in Jamaica and the Yucatan. We had several other other hurricane impacts. We had Hurricane Oscar as well as Hurricane Rafael making landfall in Cuba. And then Ernesto caused a little bit of damage as it tracked directly over Bermuda. And it's always quite the feat for a Hurricane I to track directly over Bermuda because it's a very small island in a big ocean. But Ernesto did pull that off. And unfortunately, obviously, a very impactful year for the U.S. as well. We had 5 hurricane landfalls last year. We had Beryl early in the season, caused a lot of flooding and a lot of prolonged power outages in Texas. Then we had Hurricane Debbie, which has already been discussed here a little bit. Then we had Hurricane Francine make landfall during that really pronounced lull that we had, and I'll talk more about that lull here in a couple of minutes. And then we finished the season with 2 significant Category 4 landfall, and Hurricane Helene in the Big Bend, and then finally Hurricane Milton as a Category 3 hurricane near Sarasota. So a couple of things that we look at when we talk about hurricane seasons is we kind of look at basically the whole reason we do seasonal forecasts at Colorado State is that kind of large, broad-scale conditions in the ocean and atmosphere will drive how much hurricane activity you get. And so, for example, here are the anomalies or differences from average for sea surface temperatures. So these are ocean temperature anomalies, again, differences from average from last year compared with the long-term average. So if we look at the Atlantic Ocean, okay, we see a lot of red. The Atlantic was very, very warm last year. That blue rectangle denotes what we call the main development region. That's the primary region where hurricanes develop and intensify in the Atlantic Ocean. Water temperatures in that region were about 1 degree Celsius on average warmer than normal. And 1 degree Celsius, 2-ish degrees Fahrenheit, who cares, right? But small temperature changes in the tropics, that provides a lot more fuel for the storms and also tends to alter the atmospheric environment in such a way that it becomes a lot more conducive for hurricanes. If we look in the Pacific Ocean and we look at this blue rectangle, we see water temperatures there are a little bit cooler than normal. So we were kind of right on the cusp of what we call La Nina conditions. So that blue rectangle denotes what's called the Nino 3.4 region, and that's what happens when you let a scientist name stuff. We come up with fun, catchy titles like that. But NOAA looks in that box, and when water temperatures in that box are 0.5 degree Celsius or more warmer than normal, and that persists for a few weeks, NOAA will declare an El Nino. Alternatively, when it's 0.5 degree Celsius colder than normal or colder than that, NOAA will declare a La Nina. So again, we were kind of borderline weak La Nina last year. Another thing that NOAA looks at and we look at as well is water temperatures in that box relative to the rest of the tropics, because that gets really at kind of what the circulation response will be. And we see the water temperatures in the rest of the tropics were very warm. So in some ways it was more La Nina-like than if you just look at the water temperatures in that specific box. And the reason why we care about what goes on in the Pacific Ocean, even though we're looking at hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean, is through what we call teleconnections. And this, again, is stuff that Bill Gray pioneered back in the early 1980s. So just as a refresher, El Nino is warmer than normal water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. La Nina is colder than normal water in that same region. So your thunderstorms in the Pacific Ocean typically are strongest near Indonesia, the maritime continent in the western Pacific. Thunderstorms like to form over where waters are the warmest. So in an El Nino, because those waters are warm farther to the east, those thunderstorms will shift east in response. And we get changes in our tropical circulation. So Bill Gray would also talk about an in, up, and out circulation and thunderstorm activity. So you have your winds near the ocean surface that converge into those thunderstorms. Air goes up in those thunderstorms. You get those big cumulonimbus clouds. High up in the atmosphere, those winds spread out. So if we look in the Atlantic Ocean, we tend to have winds out of the east near the ocean surface, thanks to that shift in thunderstorms, winds out of the west higher up in the atmosphere, and that tends to basically increase levels of what we call vertical wind shear, which is the change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too much shear is good for us, bad for the hurricane. It tilts the hurricane circulation. The pressures, you don't get the pressure falls you need to get the winds to accelerate. It mixes in dry air and really squelches the thunderstorms. So in an El Nino, since our winds near the ocean surface typically blow out of the east and the winds higher up blow out of the west, that really tends to increase that shear and again, knock down your storms. Last year, we had borderline weak La Nina, which tends to reduce your shear. Also, when the Atlantic is very warm, that also tends to reduce your shear. And so last year, we actually ended up with the lowest shear on record across that main development region. So, super warm Atlantic, relatively low shear, we would expect to have one of the busiest seasons on record. And we did meet that hyperactive threshold, but not quite up to the levels I think that our group and others were expecting. Obviously, when you do a seasonal forecast, you have to verify at the end of every season, and the forecast verified a lot closer to what we thought than, say, I would have guessed, say, the middle of September when we were going through that pronounced lull. Hurricane and major hurricane numbers very, very close. Certainly, if we can get the April forecast number of hurricanes and major hurricanes right on, I'm very, very happy. But if you look at the number of storms, we were too low. And a little bit of that is likely due to the fact that while we had very low shear in the tropics, the shear had higher latitudes, was stronger than normal, so we didn't get a lot of what we call more of these junk storms that form, say, off of the Carolina coast, go out to sea. We didn't get a lot of that last year. So one of the big things about last year was it was really, really weird. So the blue line is normal, the red line is last year. And so you don't see the red line and the blue line tracking very close to each other. If, say, I would have shown the same plot for 2005, it was a lot like average, except like 3 times normal the whole season. Whereas last year was, got off to a really, really busy start, and then we had this really pronounced lull. So I'm not sure, again, if you're baseball fans, but if you're thinking about this from a hurricane perspective, it got off to a rapid start. Then in the middle of the season, it started playing like it was the 2025 Colorado Rockies. Nothing happened during the peak of the season, followed by a super busy end of the hurricane season. And so there was a lot of media that came out and said, like, what the heck is going on? You all forecast, a ton of storms, and nothing is going on during the middle of the season. And so I worked with a lot of colleagues on this. We have a paper that's currently under review trying to diagnose some of the stuff that was going on to make the season so quiet. I normally don't plan on spending my Labor Day. I'd much rather be in the mountains, but I spent most of Labor Day writing a paper, like a short summary on what the heck was going on because it was so unusual. And so one of the big things that happened last year was we have what we call African easterly waves, and these are strong thunderstorm complexes. They develop over the Ethiopian highlands, they move west across Africa, emerge off the west coast of Africa. There's about 50 to 60 of these that occur each year. Most of them, thankfully, are weak, don't really cause any problems, but they're often the seeds for your hurricanes. So last year, starting in about the middle of August, we had several of these basically are kind of candidates for hurricanes. They came off very far to the north. And so if these systems were coming off, normally they come off at about the latitude of, say, Senegal. They were coming off more near northern Mauritania, western Sahara. And if you think western Sahara, you think dust, you think dry air. Also, water temperatures as you go north along the west coast of Africa get cold very quickly as you go farther north. So they came out in an environment that just was not very conducive. And so the National Hurricane Center puts out tropical weather outlooks, but they also monitor easterly waves across the Atlantic. And normally, late August, they're probably tracking 3 or 4. They may be weak, but there's 3 or 4. They were only tracking 1 across the entire Atlantic. We just didn't have the candidates. Then another thing that we had last year was, while the sea surface temperatures were very warm, we use another metric that we call potential intensity. It's kind of the juiciness of the atmosphere. That was somewhat reduced, and a lot of that was due to, while the water temperatures were warm, temperatures high up in the atmosphere, so 25, 30,000 feet, were also very warm. So that tends to kind of stabilize the atmosphere a bit. So if we look at kind of where these systems were coming off, in general they were too far to the north, but even there they just were not in a very conducive environment, even relative to normal. So I think that was another big factor that kind of knocked down why we didn't see storms. However, I should have pointed out in this previous slide, if you look at the you look at the black line and you look at kind of 2024, those systems that came off too far north, that tends to shift farther equatorward as you get later in September associated with the seasonal cycle. So that kind of thing that was kind of holding up the season started to get more conducive. Also, those systems coming off Africa came off further south, so they came over in an area that had more basically atmospheric juiciness. Also, temperatures high up in the atmosphere tend to cool at a faster rate than the water temperatures late in the season, and that also tended to help kind of mitigate this particular issue. Another issue that we had during the peak of the season last year was we had basically winds blowing out of the north, bringing dry air in from the middle latitudes. We actually had basically a high pressure area set up just to the east of Newfoundland. The circulation around that high pressure brought in all this dry air that really did kind of squelch storms as you got these systems coming off Africa at a little more conducive latitudes. And then finally, we also had less conducive phases of the Madden-Julian oscillation. And if you're in my line of work and you get an oscillation named after you, you're good to go for the rest of your life. All your grants get funded, but alas, no oscillations on my name yet. But the reason why this matters is this is tropical thunderstorm activity, moves around the globe about every 30 to 70 days. And why that matters is because it changes where air goes up and where air goes down and changes levels of vertical wind shear. So we talked about El Nino doing this on a seasonal cycle. The Madden-Julian oscillation does this on a shorter term 30 to 60 day cycle. Now, like a lot of things in meteorology, sometimes it's strong and it's a really kind of conducive predictor and you can get a lot more skill. Other times, not so much, and then you have to use other factors. But the Madden-Julian oscillation in general was quite conducive during the later part of August. But at that point, those systems coming off Africa were too far north. Then when they came a little further equatorward, we then had basically conditions that were not as conducive. The shear came up a little bit. We had a lot of sinking motion in the Atlantic. But I said that moves around the globe about every 30 to 60 days. So that particular issue also, you could see, was going to be moving into more conducive phases around September 22nd, September 23rd timeframe. As I mentioned before, your upper level temperatures also began to cool, and we ended up with an extremely busy end of the hurricane season. And obviously very significant and impactful, but just number of storms. So we went through this really pronounced lull between August 20th and September 23rd. So Bill Gray used to ring a bell every year on August 20th, signaling the active part of the Atlantic hurricane season. While it's 6 months long, it really tends to ramp up around then. The bell rang last year, nothing happened. But then, following September 23rd, we had 5 really quiet weeks. It was the quietest since 1994. But then we went and set all sorts of records from the 24th of September to October 11th. The most storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes, and accumulated cyclone energy about 4 times normal. So again, going back to baseball, that's like going in an 0 for 30 slump, and then going 9 for 11 in a 3-game homestand, hitting 5 home runs. And just to see, the first time on record, 3 hurricanes in October simultaneously. In this case, we have Hurricane Milton in the Gulf. If you look at a little farther to the northeast, you have Hurricane Kirk. And then in deep tropics, we have Hurricane Leslie. So went from setting records for quiet to setting records for busy. And really what got this all kicked off was Hurricane Helene, which I'm sure a lot of you lived through and was obviously a very, very intense event. So Helene formed from what we call a Central American or Caribbean gyre, which is this broad area of low pressure that tends to develop both early in the season and late in the season. You can get hurricanes forming both in the Atlantic and in the eastern North Pacific from these similar gyres. And actually at the same time Helene was forming, we actually also had what became Hurricane John, which brought a lot of flooding on the west coast of Mexico as a Pacific storm. So Helene was large because it formed from kind of this broad area of low pressure. And unfortunately, Helene was also not only large, it was also got very strong, making landfall as a Category 4 hurricane. Helene, unfortunately, was another one of these storms. It was rapidly intensifying pretty much up to the point of landfall. And the problem is when these storms are rapidly intensifying up to landfall, once they cross over land, they will start to weaken, but it takes a little bit longer for them to crank down because it's trying to still crank up. But when it loses its heat source, it will weaken, but it tends to weaken at a bit slower rate. Obviously, Helene was a devastating storm, 176 fatalities, $79 billion in damage. About $20 billion of it was insured, a very large insurance protection gap with Helene because so much of the damage from Helene was flooding. It was the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the Big Bend on record. Since 1851 is how far back records go. We know the Big Bend didn't have a lot of people in the late 19th century, but given how intense it was and how much stronger it was than any of the historical storms, probably at least since 1900. A whopping 16-foot storm surge, but the aerial extent of the storm surge, and I'll show that in the next slide, was really extremely notable because it was such a large storm and kind of not quite paralleling, but it was not going at, it was a little more paralleling the coast. And obviously a tremendous amount of rain, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But here you can see just the aerial extent of the storm surge from Hurricane Helene. About a 12 to 16 foot storm surge up in the eastern part of the Big Bend, but you can see a large footprint, 5 to 7 feet all the way down through Tampa Bay, even a little bit farther south towards Sarasota, even down into Charlotte Harbor. So very significant storm surge associated with Helene in addition to the wind and the flooding impacts. And obviously we saw flooding rains in Florida, but we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the flooding that we saw farther inland in the southeastern US as well. And so some of this goes back to what we call a pre-event. So pre meaning prior. What we had is we had a front that stalled over the southern Appalachian Mountains. And when a front stalls, you're going to get air that's going up along that frontal boundary, and when it does it over mountains, it tends to rain out quite a bit. Unfortunately, at the same time, we had Helene that was getting going in the Gulf, and so it was taking all that moisture from Helene and wrapping it up along that frontal boundary, and so we had a lot of rain prior to when Helene got there. But Helene did kind of an unusual track. So basically it tracked, went a little bit northeast and then curved back towards the northwest. And it really was that curve back to the northwest that was really the straw that broke the camel's back effectively with Helene. And that was because it tracked to the northwest, you again have this counterclockwise circulation going around the storm, all this additional rain falling out, and that's really what took what was bad flooding and made it truly catastrophic. This is just showing some of the rainfall totals along or in North Carolina from Helene. Obviously, we also saw a tremendous amount of flooding in North Georgia, northern South Carolina, eastern Tennessee, as well as southern Virginia. And here you can see some of the flooding. This is along the French Broad River in Asheville. What you will see, though, is that a lot of the damage from Helene was uninsured, because if we look at the National Flood Insurance Program take-up rate, and here the circle's kind of highlighting where we had the most catastrophic flooding, you see either gray or very light blue indicating less than 1% or 1 to 5% insurance take-up rates. And as Helene was coming on shore, the National Hurricane Center started putting a shape in their tropical weather outlooks in the Caribbean, highlighting another potential area of formation, and that is what became eventually Hurricane Milton. Now, Milton's genesis was very, very messy. It was a tricky one. There was a front in the northern Gulf. It was unclear if it would get entangled with that frontal boundary, but unfortunately Milton remained very distinct from that frontal boundary, and really it hit the ground running. Formed on a Saturday morning, went up to a Category 5 hurricane just a couple of days later. Pressure bottomed out below 900 millibars, all the way down to 895 millibars. And whenever you're talking pressures that low, that is really bad, because low pressure means you have a very strong storm, and you're going to have very strong winds associated with that. You can see Milton took a track kind of not west to east, but a little bit from southwest towards northeast, eventually making landfall near Sarasota. Thankfully, it did encounter quite a bit of vertical wind shear as it was coming on shore, which helped tear apart the storm. But that same shear that is bad for the hurricane is good for tornadoes, and I'll talk more about what Steve was mentioning earlier, how we had not just tornadoes, gnarly tornadoes with Hurricane Milton's landfall. So this is Milton at max intensity. At this point, it's got 180 mile per hour winds, a pressure of 895 millibars. If you look, you can kind of see that just south of Milton is actually the Yucatan Peninsula. Had Milton been just, say, 50 miles farther south, it was a very tight storm. Had that core gone over the Yucatan, probably a very different story for Florida. And that's one of the things we talk about when we talk about our seasonal forecasts. We're forecasting kind of the large-scale environment. Obviously, these kinds of things that are very localized aren't stuff that we can take into account with our seasonal forecast. Fortunately, Milton did not look like this when it came on shore. It was looking a little bit long in the tooth at this point. It encountered very strong winds high up in the atmosphere that really distorted the storm. Obviously, still brought very significant impacts across the state. Just to highlight a few of its records, it was the lowest pressure for a storm since Wilma back in 2005, the strongest hurricane intensification rate since 2007, 15 direct fatalities, $34 billion in damage, a lot less of a insurance protection gap with Milton, 18 inches of rain in St. Petersburg, 10-foot peak storm surge near Minnesota Key, 45 tornadoes. Now, hurricane-spawned tornadoes, that's not uncommon, but what is uncommon is we had 3 EF3 tornadoes, so 3 really high-octane tornadoes. Normally, tornadoes with hurricanes, you can get a lot of them, but they tend to be fairly weak. These were not weak tornadoes by any means. And so here's a kind of showing where those tornadoes were reported. There were a lot along the east coast of Florida, and I hadn't admittedly thought a ton about the time of day being really critical for tornadoes, but one of the things that happened was Milton made landfall in the evening, so in the early morning hours through the mid-morning, you had a lot of sun on the east coast of Florida, and so the atmosphere got very, very unstable. And so the reason we have tornadoes and hurricanes in the first place is because when a hurricane comes on shore, those winds near the surface weaken very quickly due to friction, but those winds higher up stay pretty strong. So you have that shear that basically develops where you have the weaker winds right at the surface but stronger winds aloft. And then you had those really strong winds high up in the atmosphere, and that strong shear combined with a lot of instability because you heated the land surface in the morning hours created a really conducive environment for tornadoes. And unfortunately, obviously, that's what we saw with Milton. So from 1995 to 2023, which is how far back the tornado hurricane data set goes, we had 5 from all those hurricane landfalls. So we had 3 just from Milton. So obviously, a very, very high octane tornadoes. And this is just showing some of the tornado damage just up the road in Fort Pierce. And so that is all the information I have. And so if you want to get in touch with me, here are a few ways. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I think you deserve a Klotzbach oscillation, by the way. Get that research every year. All right, now to our panel. Before I get our 4 panel members to come up, I want to make introductions. We're fortunate enough to have veteran emergency managers. They've agreed to share their experiences from the front lines of one of the busiest hurricane season Florida has ever seen. While the west coast of Florida wasn't the only part of the state to see impacts from Debbie, Helene, and Milton, as Phil just showed you, counties along the west coast received devastating storm surge and wind, making 2024 the most impactful hurricane season these counties have seen in our lifetimes. The damage seen along the west coast is even more unbelievable when you realize that these hurricane landfalls were often hundreds of miles from where the significant damage occurred. In Pinellas County alone, there were 47,000 residential structures damaged, over half of them categorized as major or destroyed. Estimated loss from these structures, $2.7 billion. Pinellas County sheltered more than 15,000 residents across the 3 storms. Manatee County sheltered almost 18,000 individuals across 17 shelters during Milton, and they evacuated A, B, and C evacuation zones. These statistics speak for themselves. So Tim Dudley, Kathy Perkins, Jody Fisk, and Sandra Tafumani experienced one of the busiest hurricane seasons of their career in 2024, and they have a wealth of knowledge to pass along today. And what we hope is that you'll leave here today, kind of understanding, hopefully being a little bit more prepared, learning from what went right and what went wrong during their hurricane coverage, especially the aftermath. All right, Tim Dudley first. He serves as the Director of Emergency Management for Hillsborough County. His service in the Army inspired his calling to work in the field of disaster planning and management. As you watch the events of Hurricane Katrina unfold, Dudley took a hard look at the planning and response tactics. During his military years, he studied the field. Army structure turned out to be well suited for him, and he spent 27 years making it a career. Just like his grandfather mentored him, Dudley spent his years building teams and fostering skills in future leaders. Dudley obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in Homeland Security, a Master's of Science degree in Emergency Services Management, and certificates in Executive Leadership. Dudley's final role in the military was Operations Sergeant Major at the U.S. Special Operations Command in Tampa. He retired as a decorated Sergeant Major in 2014, and he and his family are happy to be home. He resides in the Tampa area with his wife, Shawnette, and their 4 children and 1 grandchild. Kathy Perkins is currently the Emergency Management Director in Pinellas County and has over 30 years' experience in disaster response. In 1993, she started working in Miami-Dade, hardest hit areas recovering from Hurricane Andrew. Kathy worked for Miami-Dade Emergency Management for 15 years and worked on numerous programs and responses, including the Value Jet plane crash and responding to New York City as part of the 9/11 response. Kathy worked as a firefighter paramedic, then continued her work in the field of emergency management and disaster response as a consultant, helping numerous counties around the state. She served as the Pinellas County Emergency Management Director since October 2018. One of her hobbies is puzzles, which, like her job, is trying to figure out how to put all the puzzle pieces together. Jody Fisk is the Director of Public Safety for Manatee County, Florida. Under her leadership, Manatee County navigated the complex responses to Hurricanes Debbie, Helene, and Milton in the historic 2024 season. Before joining the team at Manatee County, Jody served as the Region 6 Emergency Response Coordinator and Supervisor of the Regional Response Coordination Team with the Florida Division of Emergency Management. During her time with FDEM. She responded to multiple hurricanes, including Michael and Ian, wildfires, and other emergencies that impacted several counties in the state of Florida. Currently resides in Manatee County with her husband Justin, their 3 children, Madison, Kyle, and Anna. And Sandra Tapfumane, my apologies, Sandra, has served as the Chief of Emergency Management, I warned you, in Sarasota County from January 2024. She led the County Emergency Operations Center through the historic 2024 hurricane season, including Milton, which made landfall in Sarasota County. She previously served as the Chief of Lee County Emergency Management and was recognized as the Chad Reed Emergency Management Professional of the Year by the Florida Emergency Preparedness Association in 2023. 2022, she served as the Incident Commander of the Lee County Emergency Operations Center during Hurricane Ian, one of the most catastrophic hurricanes ever to hit the U.S. Sandra has more than 22 years of professional experience. It includes various roles such as the Director of Lee County Domestic Animal Services, Operations Section Chief for Lee County Emergency Management, and an emergency management consultant for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and a human rights intern for President Jimmy Carter at the Atlanta-based Carter Center. She holds a master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution from American University and a Bachelor of Arts in international relations and global affairs from Eckerd College. Please give me a warm welcome. Have all our 4 guests come up, our panel guests this morning, and we're going to talk about last year's hurricane season.
Like a ghost.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We really appreciate it. We want to make this as relaxed as possible. We want more of a coffee talk session, but what we really want to do is have you describe your experiences during last year's season, and so that everyone in the audience can take away what you learned, what went right, what maybe didn't go so right. And you know, this is not confusing, but we have 3 hurricanes to essentially hit the same area in the course of, what, a month. We had Debbie, Helene, and Milton. I mean, Helene and Milton, we're going to really focus on those storms because they had an impact less than 2 weeks. So you're dealing with major hurricanes, one after another. It reminds me of the 2004, 20 years earlier, the 2004 season here when we had Francis and Jean. We had a 3-week window between Francis and Jean, and I was here. It was chaotic. And I think 3 weeks was at least enough time to at least get the essentials back up and running, but for you, maybe not so. And we'll talk about that. All right, so we'll focus on Debbie first. A couple of the stats already mentioned. Pinellas County, 171 alert. Pinellas County notification sent, over 280,000 FEMA individual assistance registrations, 4,000 logistics mission requests. Manatee County, 18,000 sheltered in Milton alone, over 2,000 pets, which is a big issue in hurricane preparation, and evacuations, zones A, B, and C evacuated. Really an incredible hurricane season, and as Phil mentioned, a real surreal season because we had Debbie and then there was this 5-week lull where there was just nothing at all. And I know, being in the media, that people will let their guard down because of that, and we'll talk about maybe if that was an issue for you as you dealt with the hurricane response last year. So Sandra, we'll start with you first. I'd love to hear your perspective on Hurricane Debbie. You had $58 million in damages. The storm, one of the issues, the storm was 100 miles offshore as it passed Sarasota County. You had over 1,000 residences damaged. Kind of talk us through the Hurricane Debbie response and what you had to deal with.
Sure. Well, on behalf of the panel, thanks for having all of us here to talk about our very active season. So we started off with Debbie, and actually Manatee County and Sarasota County had a rain event even a couple of weeks before Debbie. So we started even a little earlier, and that rain event had about 6-7 inches of rain. So when we had the forecast coming in for Debbie, Originally, they were about that same amount, and so we felt confident that we would be able to absorb, even though we had an above average rainy season. But as the storm passed by, and it was just a tropical storm, and I encourage all of you to refrain from using the word just before tropical storm, but you know, your residents are a little bit, maybe their guard is a little bit down, they're not paying as close of attention because those winds are not really the factor. But as you saw the radar go and the storm made its way up the Gulf, we continued to be on the outskirts of that outer rain bands, both us and Jody in Manatee County. And so that led to 17 inches of rain over 48 hours. And it accumulated and manifested in multiple areas across the county, widespread flooding. As you mentioned, over 1,000 homes impacted. And so and National Weather Service said that percentage to get that much rain in our counties was a 0.05% chance that it would accumulate the way that it did. So very, very low percentage, but it had great impacts. We had our own emergency operations center with challenges. We had activated to a level 2. We had people overnight monitoring, and they had some trouble, additional staff getting to the EOC. Our own assistant county manager came in, and he had collected a catfish in the parking lot on his way in. Our warehouse we couldn't get to because it was flooded out, so we had some challenges getting supplies out to our post-impact shelter. And we did open up, with the help of our Florida Division of Emergency Management, a multi-agency resource center that then turned into a disaster recovery center when we were federally declared. But I did want to give just a shout out to, we had Task Force 6, the Urban Search and Rescue Team down in the Fort Myers area, reached out as they were watching the storm, and it was predicted to make landfall in the Big Bend. They were forecasted and planning to deploy up there. And they said, hey, just in case something happens, we'll be available for you guys. So as soon as they saw that we were impacted, we connected them with our first responders. 2 days later, we had 3 additional urban search and rescue teams in our county. So they went door to door to make sure people were safe, and we did end up evacuating some people that wanted to get out of the elements.
Kathy, this came up in one of our Zoom meetings. All the storms seem to blend together, especially right one after another. Anyone that want to add your response to, if you remember Hurricane Debbie's response, anyone want to add anything else?
Yeah, so for Debbie, we didn't issue evacuations. We had community centers on standby. And I think what was hard, we knew we were going to get some coastal flooding, more like nuisance flooding in some homes. And we had heard from residents in the past, they appreciated it when we didn't evacuate them, because that's the type of water that they could be proactive with. They could do things as, you know, the little inch or two of water was coming into their garages or maybe into their homes. They could take actions and do something as opposed to coming back later when everything was already saturated. I think the big thing for us is we saw the boater impact. We have a lot of liveaboards, and I've listened very closely to lessons from Monroe County and also from Lee County from Hurricane Ian. That's a very vulnerable population. For some folks, that is affordable housing now. And we actually had a fatality. They said it wasn't due to the storm, but it was somebody that had stayed on their boat. And I think, you know, we did a whole campaign for boaters, so I think it's really important to really look at those vulnerable populations and the messaging for that. So we will be increasing that messaging as we go along, and I think in the future we will open up those community centers, even if we're not calling for the evacuations, because there are a lot of worried well. And I think because of this hurricane season, we're going to see, just like we did for Milton, a higher group of people that want to move out of their homes.
Did you have, especially, you know, bring up the boater issue, it kind of reminds me of the pet issue. You have people who, they have the additional challenge, and boaters, I'm a boater, it's an unusual breed. You don't want to leave your vessel. I mean, it's where you live. I don't live on a boat, but where a lot of people do live, and you're not going to outrun the storm. So you get into a very tricky situation that way. I digress. Did you want to add something to the Debbie response?
So for Debbie, for Hillsborough County, we saw significant rain, over 12 inches in a short period of time. There was a strong tropical storm for us, 75 miles off the coast. Didn't have to open any shelters, so we thought, hey, this passed us by. But what we continue to see the weeks past is our rivers continue to crest. So we had extreme prolonged riverine flooding that we would come to find out would set the foundation for significant impacts for 2 storms.
Just like Phil mentioned with Helene, you had that set up, and we've seen it here in South Florida, where it's not always the rain just coming with the hurricane, it's the rain that's happened in the week before that can cause serious issues. Sounds like the same situation you went through with Debbie.
Yes, sir.
So even though Debbie, obviously the other hurricanes had a bigger impact, like you said, Debbie created some of those issues because of the rain it left.
Absolutely. And normally, we did 12 inches. We usually average about 9 inches normally during that time of year. So significant rain.
Yeah. Jody, anything you want to add?
Debbie was interesting for us because you had so many residents that flooded that hadn't flooded before. And so it was an interesting way to kick off the season, I think, because when Helene rolled around, there was still some pretty fresh memories of Debbie. And so I think as much as I want to take credit for messaging and being aggressive with it, the way that this storm season played out, when you start with unprecedented flooding, we had, Lake Manatee, we have all the waters, the rivers. So it was interesting to kind of see how it played out. That was, I think, a shock for a lot of residents, but I think ultimately it's leading to a lot of really good discussions afterwards on infrastructure with the funding that comes and all that. But that was eye-opening for a lot of our residents.
All right.
Messaging that inland flooding is probably the most difficult thing. I heard from residents. I live 30 feet above sea level. I've lived here for 40 years. It's never flooded here. And getting people to understand, when you see that quantity of rain coming in with a storm, especially when you've had a wet season leading up to that, the impacts of that are just confounded. And that's really hard to message. We've gotten really good at, we know where the evacuation zones are. We can guide people to look that up and to be more prepared for that. That inland flooding is still a challenge for us.
Okay, let's move on to Helene now. Made landfall on the Gulf Coast, Category 4 hurricane. Winds at 140, storm surge 12 to 16 feet around the Big Bend. A devastating event for all of your counties, considering the 2023 hurricane season that you faced the year before. I want to start with you first, Kathy. Helene, what was your talk about the initial response that you went through with Helene?
So I think what's really scary for Pinellas County is we're a peninsula. We're attached to the mainland, just at the northern part of our county, and the rest of it is bridges. And all those bridges were shut down by Thursday at 6 p.m. And that's our greatest fear, is if we get hit, how do we get the resources in, making sure that we can have that in advance. And I would highly recommend to everybody, anytime you have a storm coming at you that's bigger than anything you've experienced, is get ready to ramp up. And we had conversations with logistics providers, working to get them in as quickly as possible. Because most of us are really good at the response. We're good at opening shelters and closing them back down and doing that evacuation. Besides Sandra, probably not a lot of us have had multiple years of recovery for these really big storms, and making sure that you get those resources in quickly so you can turn everything on and get everything going as quickly as possible. During the storm, that was the indicator that this was going to be really bad. We had over 1,400 calls for water rescues. Indicator that people hadn't evacuated, they hadn't followed the orders. So, really working through the hours overnight, just looking at where were all the 911 calls coming in at the point when the rescue crews ceased operations. Where were those calls where we weren't able to get to people, knowing that needed to be the priority. Getting the search and rescue teams in, making sure that we could shut down the barrier islands. It's really tricky, right? Because your residents want to get back into their community. They want to look at their homes, but you have to balance that with public safety, and you've got rescue operations going on. I think we have 24 municipalities in our county, so we had 25 different communities to assess and stay in touch with. We did our best to try to make sure that everybody had communications, the satellite communications before the storm. We hadn't got them out to everybody. So, making sure that you can continue that communication, getting that quick pulse of what has happened in your community, and then really trying to figure out how do you prioritize, where do you send all the resources. There were different impacts in different areas of the county. So that is like the biggest challenge, and you can't always wait till daylight. You're planning. You're not going to sleep the night of. I learned that through multiple storms this year. You're hoping to get a little bit of rest, but things just start happening. Your phone is buzzing all night long. So we had fire alarms ringing. We had structure fires. We had people that needed to be rescued. So just so many challenges.
Jody, your thoughts on your initial response during Helene?
So I think one of the really important things that we did was it was a very coordinated message that came from the county and the municipalities together. Prior to landfall, we had just about 1,000 people in shelters. So some people were listening, but like Kathy has said, there's the group of people that think, I went through Hurricane Ian and I was fine. I've lived in Florida this whole time. So when that storm surge started rolling in, that was incredibly scary for a lot of our residents. I think our teams facilitated just about over 400 water rescues. So throughout the night, you're watching those shelter numbers go up, and you're seeing people, and it's not just the individuals, it's their pets. We were coordinating with the search and rescue teams that were coming in, and the 911 calls. We're really excited with the investment the county's making into technology for us, but we're going to be able to map those in real time now for this season. But that was a big lesson from last year, especially when you have to stop running rescue at some point because the water was too strong for the vehicles. So we coordinated a lot with the state prior to landfall for some of the dam mitigation, or the Tiger Dam, the mitigation efforts. But a lot of it was, as you're watching the impacts come in, just trying to be proactive and putting your missions in, coordinating that messaging, and being consistent. And that was, it was challenging, but it was something that I think we're very good at in Florida. And I don't really know at what point I became a veteran, but working with people like Sandra and Lee over the last few years and other directors in the states, and looking at that, the actions you take leaning forward before landfall makes a huge difference. And so just coordinating that with the state and your local partners.
Sandra, your initial response for Helene.
This was another storm that was, well, for Sarasota, I think similar to the other counties here, 140 miles off of our coast. So getting people to pay attention, that's always a struggle. I think the changes with the forecast cone that the National Hurricane Center rolled out this last year, the experimental, the ability to show those impacts inland, and that visual helped us. But the one thing I'll add, in Sarasota County, it was 80 years since they had seen this type of storm surge. We had about 5 to 7 feet along our coastline, and I think there was a mixed bag of people who maybe evacuated and some that didn't. But the sand was a huge thing that we've got to talk about, because the force that the storm surge pushed sand onto our coastlines was extreme. So I don't know if anyone's here from a snow-laden state up north, but if you remember the blizzards from the 80s, and you're talking 8 to 10 feet of piles of sand. So we had to do a push to get the sand off of the roads in order to access a lot of those routes. And I know that created its own set of challenges. You're pushing sand off of public roads onto private property in a lot of places. And I know then you have to go back and explain, well, we're not here to pick up all of the sand in your home and on your property, just the ones that we pushed over. And I'd heard, Kathy, that you guys used the National Guard to go behind and help shovel some of that sand. But it was a big challenge that we had never certainly faced in Sarasota County. But yeah, it was a tremendous effort. Now this also, interestingly enough, we didn't really have the winds that you would traditionally get. So this was mainly a surge event for our county. But it was a lot, because we're still in the recovery from Debbie. And so we had to shift focus and make sure that people were taking the storm seriously.
And the challenge with all that sand is all of your underground infrastructure was buried underneath it.
Right.
So we had probably thousands of water line leaks that they had to try to turn off and find, and just the detection of that, the electric companies being able to get in and to repair the underground infrastructure.
Right, because it blocks off probably the only way in and out, because it's in this area it's A1A, and Francis and Jean, we dealt with that where, okay, there's sand on the road, you can't go through it, your only way to get to the other side is to do a 40-mile trap around 2 or 3 counties.
And as soon as the residents came back in, they want to start cleaning out their homes. So now we have piles of sand, and then you have debris piled on top of that. So there were a lot of challenges.
Any thoughts, Tim, on the initial response from Helene?
So initial response for us, it was record-breaking surge for us, over 7 feet. We were prepared for 5 to 8 feet. They predicted, again, those rivers giving us problems. So the LFI was predicted at 7.
Because of Debbie's rain?
Because of Debbie. And then, so that came in over 9 feet. So now we have to concentrate messaging on not just the folks that were impacted by the surge, but the inland riverine flooding too, to make sure that those folks understood that, hey, we're talking to you also, not just the folks on the coast. The first responders did a phenomenal job. National Weather Service spot on, said we would start seeing impacts around 11 o'clock at night. And as I was prepared to go bed down, my phone rang, and we send a message out. It was my son. He's calling me, he's over there in Pinellas County with Kathy. I'm originally from St. Petersburg, and he's like, Dad, the water's coming in. And he hadn't evacuated. So I'm going over to see the fire chief to see what we can get done to do for him, and they're already ramped up. They've got calls, PSAP, Pasco County's calling me, everybody's looking for high water rescue vehicle. All the PSAPs in the Tampa Bay area and every one of ours going off around between 11 and 12 o'clock asking for assistance. So they did about 1,100 rescues that night. So we had two deaths for Helene that were attributed to the storm. So that was a blessing as well, that we didn't see a significant loss of life. But on the other side, as we prepared to respond for the unmet needs, that's when we got the introduction of the new resources, the comfort stations. So another blessing we had, our main routes weren't compromised. So we were able to look at pre-identified pod sites and see which ones were not impacted and get those comfort station ups. They were a big hit. We kind of enhanced that resource. We put 2 hot meals in there, working with some of our partners there while folks were there just trying to get themselves together. We also worked with the FEMA folks because we had a shortage. Remember, we didn't have that many DRCs, the disaster recovery centers, to go about. So we had to kind of split that resource up. So we had some teams that were going out door to door, so we kind of pre-positioned them as well. Also with some permanent folks. So we really leveraged those comfort stations to see if we could serve as many folks as we could.
Let's talk about the public messaging. Is there anything that stands out that worked and didn't work, especially in the storm surge part? Everyone focuses on the winds, but in almost all your cases, the surge was, the most serious issue, and the flooding too. Anything stand out that worked and maybe didn't work?
We used a visual graphic from the last time when we had 4 feet of surge, and we had a number of our coastal communities. We had over 1,500 homes flood from 4 feet of surge. And it was more nuisance flooding. It wasn't, up above the outlets or anything. So we used that, and then we superimposed on that what was predicted for Helene. And I think that kind of visual made more of an impact for people. It's hard, unless you've been through it or experienced it. I mean, even when we were supposed to get Ian, and in the last minute, unfortunately, fortunately for us, but it turned down.
Thanks, Kathy.
South of us, you're welcome. And it's like, we kept thinking, well, people saw that it was going to be us, and it hit Lee, and they saw what happened in Lee. They'll be like, oh my goodness, like the next time one comes, we need to leave. And we just don't see that until people experience it themselves. They just can't fathom it. We had a couple of high-rise buildings along coastal communities, and again, we tell them to evacuate. Unfortunately, I've heard some folks say if you're in a high-rise building, you're fine because you're up above whatever floor the surge isn't going to get you, but all of your critical infrastructure is on that ground floor. We had a high-rise building, it was a 55-plus building. Above the 10th floor, they had no water, their elevators had gone out, and their electricity was very sporadic. We ended up having to evacuate them post-storm. And that's a lot of work, right? While you're trying to work on the response and getting into the communities, now we had all these other populations that hadn't evacuated that we needed to address. I would say immediately after Helene, we were making great progress. We had gone out, we'd done the initial damage assessments, the power companies were really rocking it in terms of restoration and repairs. The utility companies, we were doing great. We were really happy with where we were. We had just opened up a disaster recovery center. I mean, we were making progress. We had pods, we had a lot of things in place. We were starting to work on the debris issues. We were feeling good, and then Mother Nature threw a monkey wrench into it.
I think Kathy's right. The visual is what people need to see.
Yeah.
We learned that in Lee County in Hurricane Ian. When you talk about 15 feet of storm surge or whatever feet you want to put on it, the visual of that going far inland is something that is hard to wrap your brain around. So we started using this season in Sarasota County the potential flooding map for the storm surge inundation that the National Hurricane Center pulls out. And so we were doing live videos with the map up, with a touch screen to scroll through all of the areas in the county to show exactly what we mean. This is what this color means in your area. If you're along this river, because we saw people were talking, we're evacuating, we're sending the messages out, and we were getting back in. Well, but I live like far inland next to a river. Does that mean I need to evacuate? And they're in a level A, And so that we felt that map was helpful because you could literally pinpoint these areas across the county. And our comms team is great. They push out, through Ring and Next Door, and we did flyers and door to door with first responders in the most vulnerable communities, just to make sure people knew that they really did need to evacuate.
Right. Jody, any and the messaging, especially storm surge, anything that stands out?
We were very similar to the counties in the visuals that we used, and then I have to give a lot of credit to our external affairs team because they came up with this battle rhythm of these little 2 to 3 minute informational videos that we were pushing out just every few hours. The surge is rolling in, now is the time to shelter in place, and consolidating the information into just a quick website that folk could go to that was a one-stop shop. It had all of your information previously pushed out, the visuals, any information and updates, and keeping that constant flow of information. So Ring went a little bit bananas with the amount of notifications that they would push out, but we actually were getting a lot of back and forth with our residents as well, who were responding to the videos, or they were seeing a video and then calling 311 and saying, hey, I just saw this video, what does that mean? So it was a way to keep everybody engaged, but I think that because it demonstrated, we're here, we're working, we're doing all of what we need to do, it kept the public engaged with us enough that the message was getting through. And it's, we talk about the Helene response, we had about 6 days of actual response, and so it really was the life safety, it was the damage assessments, and then it gets into a big blur because you went right back into it for Milton. And so recovery was one of those things that just, it took a minute. You had to stop and take a step back and really kind of gather yourself from what you were doing, because the response really did for Helene, if you really want to get technical, it was just a week.
Anything you want to add to the messaging part? Anything that stands out that worked and maybe didn't work?
So what works well for us is predictability. So we have our standard press times built into the battle rhythm. So the public, they give us pretty good feedback. Our communications, they're very good at keeping us locked in, making sure that the peak news cycles, that's how the battle rhythm is set. So they know when to come in, all the officials know when to come in. So we had a lot of folks that they recognized from the community and throughout. So just being consistent and folks knowing where to tune into to get that predictability.
Okay. All right, and just a brief, I want to, because we haven't got to Milton yet, focusing on sheltering for Helene. Issues that came up, pluses, minuses, challenges. I know there's some staggering numbers here, tens of thousands of people sheltered.
So for sheltering, like Kathy's mentioned, we have that portion of it down. But on the other side, when you have that transitional period, the transitional sheltering. We set the initial transition shelter up, and you have those folks that they have impacts, they're not able to get back home. So in Helene, we had started that process. We didn't see the great numbers that we would eventually see in Milton. As a matter of fact, we had to move that shelter as Helene began the approach. If we had it in one of our evacuation zones, as we had to move that up. So that's a lesson learned. Having that qualified folks to go in and begin that case management to help those folks start to recover and get back to normal as quick as possible.
Okay. I think we better move on to Milton because we have a lot of storms to cover. All right, let's pivot to Hurricane Milton. Tim, I'll start with you. Hillsborough County, 1.5 million people. You just went through Helene. You're looking at another, incredible hurricane headed your way. First, what's going through your head when you see this coming? You're still in the thick of dealing with Helene effects.
Absolutely. So the first thing we did, myself and my leadership team, we went in the conference room, kind of gathered around, hugged each other, took a deep breath, and say, let's go get it. So what we did for that particular one, we started looking at the certain things. We've seen that before. So we've had to wrap up field operations, get everything secured. The state has sent an order that they're shutting down assets that's being ran by the state. So we're doing the same thing. Now we're looking at a larger evacuation impacting over 300,000 folks this time. So we're increasing the number of shelters. We prepared for 16 shelters. We don't only prepare for our folks in Hillsborough County, but our neighboring county as well. So we have the capacity to do that. So just doing that analysis as well. And then how we're going to get our arms wrapped around it. 2023, during our EOC Readiness Week, we begin introducing community lifelines and recovery support functions. So those worked tremendously well for us. It gave a great foundation and focus area, set the priorities in the community lifeline. So the EOC did a phenomenal job once we flipped it up and say, hey guys, we've already trained on this. Here's your priorities. Begin pushing this information and let's start planning for that. And then on the backside, the recovery support function, we're currently still using those today to move through those 3 recovery events.
Similar experience for you, Kathy, with Milton, less than 2 weeks?
Yeah, it was surreal. I had gone to a Marley Brothers concert the weekend after Helene, and I was feeling nice and relaxed and good. And then I was supposed to have 2 days off, and then I looked at the forecast, and I was like, that's not going to happen. I think most of us know how difficult it is to be away from the office when everything is happening. So I think it was very surreal. People probably thought we were kidding. Hey, we're going to do this again. The challenge, part of that with sheltering is, so we rely on 16% of all of our BCC departments to provide staffing for our shelters, and then a lot of those folks have to go into recovery operations, our public works and parks folks. So they were trying to transition out, and now we have to call everybody back up for shelters. We have to reassess which shelters were available. We had a lot of people that lost cars. We had a lot of people that on the barrier islands, in particular coastal areas, which are most vulnerable for surge and the ones that we were going to have to evacuate again.
So they couldn't even evacuate it? Well, they couldn't use a car to evacuate.
They were busy working on, they may not be monitoring social media, they may not, their phones might be, dead, can't recharge them, so we had comfort stations. So we had to really kind of switch the way that we were going out through neighborhoods, doing PA announcements and making sure that we were getting out to all of those neighborhoods to communicate with people that we had another one coming. I think what we saw for Milton is obviously we saw a lot more people come into shelter. We also saw people bring a lot more stuff with them because they didn't want to lose what little they had left. A lot of people, the thing with evacuating, if you evacuate ahead, you can take your precious items with you, right? The people that got plucked out of the water during the storm, they were lucky to they had the clothes on their back. So, a lot of people just tried to scoop up what they could and bring it in. Tremendous number of people coming in with pets, people coming in without cages for the pets, where to put them in. So just a lot of resources. I don't even know what was happening with the grocery stores. I don't know if people were having difficulty even getting additional supplies if they'd already used them up in the weeks between. So just a lot of challenges. And then we had just opened everything up and now we had to shut it down. In a way, we were maybe lucky because we had state and federal and other resources that we held hostage during Milton, so we could get them on the street immediately after. That was a bonus there. But then it became really messy because now you were dealing with 2 storms and some of the FEMA regulations and, you know, which debris went with which storm, you know, and then we had people that had been impacted 3 times this season, so individual assistance, and yeah, it got really messy.
Yeah. Jody, your experience with Milton.
So really very similar. You know, we went from 1,000 people pre-landfall with Helene to 11,000 plus pre-landfall for Milton. You know, our municipalities, Bradenton Beach, Holmes Beach, their law enforcement and fire rescue teams did an amazing job of going door to door on the beach and making sure that anybody who was there knew we are looking at another surge coming in. You know, Sandra's mentioned the sand. We were just starting to get a handle on what we were maybe going to be able to do to address the sand, and now we were going to have to stop that to get ready for this next storm to come in. We're very lucky with our school district. You know, our schools are our shelters, so they just cleaned them, and now we have to open them back up. And then lessons learned from Helene with those water rescues, where those people are getting plucked out of the water and dropped off at the shelter so they can go back out and get the next one. So you had a lot of assets on the ground that it was like, hey, look, we got you a comfort station. Okay, we're kidding. We're going to take it back, but it'll be back after this one, maybe. And so when you start looking at trying to get your resources back and kind of get your feet back under you, but I think one of the things that really kind of made everyone come together was we just went through this. You can see the sand on the beach. You can see the debris is still there. We are going to be able to get back from this, but we have to handle what's coming next. And so it's just, you control what you can control, but it's one step at a time. It's one issue at a time. And it was frustrating. I'm not going to lie. It was irritating to look at that forecast because you're just getting a handle on what you're going to do for this one, and here comes the next one. So the coordination with the state and the partners at FEMA, especially looking ahead at debris, sand, how are we going to do this? That was really important for us.
And Sandra, you probably still had people in shelters from Helene, and Milton's on the way?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we were landfall, and so our storm surge forecast was we were looking at 12 plus feet at one point, and so we were very concerned, and we were doing catastrophic planning as we were watching the storm come in. So, you know, for us, we did look at that inland push, and we're expecting the storm surge to travel inland. So we did an A, B, and C evacuation, which is about 235,000 people, the largest evacuation Sarasota County has ever called. And people were surprised that we're in that level C. They were. We did have 2 million hits to our Know Your Level page, and we only have 400,000 residents. So it tells you how many times people went there. But that was good. So they were paying attention. It helps that we had Helene. I think we had talked about that. People actually saw the visual of the storm surge coming in. I think it heated, and the execution of the evacuations and the adherence to it was higher. But we knew we still had some people that refused to evacuate. So we were doing the catastrophic planning. Our air ops branch activated. We were coordinating with the Florida National Guard, the state DOC. We were preparing for the loss of the bridges. We were preparing for catastrophic failure of our water infrastructure. And so we were doing all those things that we had seen happen down during Hurricane Ian, and we were preparing for that. So we felt, although you can only do so much with that amount of storm surge, that we were in a good spot. And thankfully, that it did manifest, but only in a very small part of our county, the southernmost part. Manasota Key shared with Charlotte County. That key is what that, and we heard Dr. Phil talk about that, right? How it came in, but the angle that it came in, it was a tremendous amount of storm surge, but it was isolated down to that little piece. And then the rest still got the same, almost exact same surge that we saw in Helene. And Jody's right, the damage on top of the damage created some interesting challenges for us as we went through the recovery of that.
Yeah, and let's talk about debris, because I'm sure in 04 with Francis and Jean, I mean, it was a staggering amount of just junk everywhere after Francis. We had 3 weeks. I felt like we did a really good job cleaning most of it up, and then Jean came along, and the debris that was after the second storm, it was more significant, but it wasn't all this like almost junk. Like it'd been decades since we had any kind of significant hurricane here, so there was just stuff around that just didn't belong here. and it just blew away. Did you have I'm sure you had a similar situation in your area where you just had, I mean, I saw some of the videos coming out of the West Coast where it was, just a lot of stuff that probably didn't, isn't going to go through a hurricane, and now you have a second storm coming. You want to talk about the debris and what you had to deal with?
Yeah, for Milton, we saw a negative surge on that, and we saw an additional 18 inches of rain on top of what we had already received. So we had the debris along our 76 miles of coast from the previous one in Helene with the surge, and now we have this inland flooding throughout the county, over 1,000 square miles throughout the county. So we got all of it. So you had the wind and then all the debris created from the surge, and then now we have the flooding and all the debris from that. That generated 4.8 million cubic yards of debris for us. It's over 111,000. They equated it to trucks being lined up from Tampa Bay to Alabama. And the team did a phenomenal job. That's overseen by our public works and public utility teams. Our procurement team went out and got additional haulers. We had 2 on contract. We got additional haulers that we put on there, set them in their quadrant and area of responsibility throughout the county, and they got at it. And they got everything cleaned up and buttoned up by February on the standard debris. Our waterway debris, we just finished that up in April with assistance from the state. Over 104,000 cubic yards of waterway debris that we finished up in April. And we moved 36 million gallons of water. We had sustained flooding throughout the county, and we find out that Pasco County is the culprit. We have 17 different watersheds in Hillsborough County. So Andy, I don't know if he's here now, but we just did a track out of Grieve. Yeah. So he's still got 2 areas in Pasco County that is still flooding to this day. We did not finish moving water until December. So tremendous job by our public works team getting that water moved out of there. So with the waterway debris buttoned up, so we're good to go. Everything is clean, and so we're reset and ready to go for that. So tremendous challenge, but the team got it done.
And I know you had big debris issues. Any best practices, anything that you learned or something that happened that you might do differently next time?
Don't have a storm. Yeah. So the barrier islands, and some of these communities are tiny. They're a mile, 2 miles big, and you have a lot of residential and commercial side by side. And it gets very complicated. The FEMA rules, you got to keep your commercial and your residential separate, and then you've got your separate piles. With Helene, we saw a lot of home materials, personal goods, things like that were being put out on the curb. With Milton, it was a wind event, and now we had a lot of tree debris on top of that. So, and you had it in all these different areas, right? So Helene was very coastal, but Milton was more inland, and then also in South St. Pete, our southern portion of our county, got the highest winds. So just so many different types of debris trying to deal with. We're very limited for open spaces and challenged with that. So making sure that everybody's got their debris management sites in place. Unfortunately, there was competition with contracts going back out and being rebid. That made it difficult for all of us because now we were scrambling to compete. Haulers don't want to take debris long distances, so that's always a challenge for us. We worked with FEMA to try to can we just call it all Milton debris after Milton hit? So finally we got that. There was a lot of back and forth over just legal terminology, simple words. It took days to kind of iron some of that out. The state came in and wanted us to do 24-hour debris operations. That was a challenge too, because we ended up sometimes splitting crews. So it wasn't like you were getting more people, you were just splitting the people that were out there. Just lots of challenges. I think, as we move forward and working with our municipalities, looking at our contracts, how can we do it better regionally? How can we make sure that we're not competing with each other for that as well?
Jody, any takeaways from the debris issue after the storm?
We essentially had 2 debris operations happening at the same time. You had the debris that we all think of with debris, and then the sand operation, which was totally different. So you had, when you were picking a site, you weren't just picking your debris site, you were also having to factor in, okay, where am I going to put these hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of sand, and what are we going to do with it? So it required a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, especially in terms of once you got it to where it was going to go, were you going to clean it? Were you just going to reuse it? How were you going to deal with this problem? And it required a lot of communication and collaboration with, Sarasota County, because we do share Longboat Key, but also with the municipalities, because they had debris operations within the cities going on, but you have that other operation happening at the same time. And so it was just a balancing act, but Kathy nailed it, trying to get down to the bottom of some of the questions that we had about how are we categorizing this? Like, what storm are we doing? Are we just washing our hands and saying, all right, they were so close together, it's all one and the same, and just do whatever you need to do? Because you don't want to start until you know what that answer is. And so it was a difficult coordination, I think, at the beginning. It smoothed out really, really quickly, but it's a big lift. And then when you start talking about the contracts, I remember getting a phone call from Sarasota that was like, hey, what did you do? I did what the state did. So
hey, what's going on up in your county up there with your contracts?
Yeah,
that was the conversation.
It's a lot. You're coordinating all of that. So that was new for me. I'm not going to lie. I never had to deal with that question as a coordinator.
Similar issues?
Yeah, very similar issues. I'll just add that in our county, we did end up with 2.4 million cubic yards. We did meet the 90-day deadline in heroic efforts by our solid waste team. But our county manager, we had different debris. You've got your residential, commercial, you have your waterway, and then you have your county properties that you're trying to also deal with all at the same time. And it's not all solid waste, or your public works, whoever does that for your community. So you have different entities, and emergency management was involved with trying to facilitate. But our county leadership wanted a better facilitation of all of those areas, and so they have asked emergency management to take a more active role in coordinating all of that, similar to how we're used to doing mass care, and we're the facilitator and we're helping coordinate all these pieces. And so this next year we're moving into a new phase, currently hiring for a debris and recovery person, so come see me if you're interested. But we are working on having a more coordinated approach and being able to utilize the full backing of the EOC instead of just having departments go back and try to handle everything on their own.
There was a lot of managing expectations, both at the county level with their teams that were working, but also with the public. Because there really is an expectation, like, well, my area got hit by a hurricane, when is my stuff going to get picked up? And you have to manage those expectations as best you can, so that can be a balancing act. You've got those back-to-back impacts.
I think we all leveraged that and managed that. We had different maps on our websites, letting folks kind of predicting, letting them know when we'll be to your area, and that kind of brought the angst down and gave them a little bit more understanding.
At least they had a time kind of like the power coming back on. If you know, if you get a time, even though it may be 2 weeks later, you feel, for whatever reason, better about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Trees were a huge issue for us after Milton, so I know this year we want to do more with campaigns for tree trimming, how to appropriately do that. People had these giant trees because we haven't had a wind event in over 100 years like that in Pinellas, and they were getting quotes of anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 to remove these trees. And not all of that's covered by insurance. So there were a lot of kind of unmet needs in that area. Is that stuff that we could include in our debris? So a lot of challenges, and I think something that would be a good campaign for emergency management to really work with arborists on how to better prepare those trees, especially when you see that ground saturation that we did, because those trees are going to come down a lot faster.
And I know I think you still have a housing issue in your county. Any thoughts on improving that process?
Yeah, so housing was a big challenge. At the height, we had over 3,900 households that were staying either in hotels through TSA with FEMA or non-congregate sheltering with the state. That's over 7,500 individuals. We still have over 100 households that are still in those programs, and here we are 7 months later. I think a big hurdle to that was the permitting, right? So we had a lot of structures that had to be assessed for substantial damage. So I'm just going to beg all of you, if you haven't gone through substantial damage and having to do that process, you know, start having conversations with other communities that have had to go through this. Make sure that you're engaging everybody, your property appraiser, all your building officials, all of your inspectors. Online permitting was a huge issue. You know, a lot of our smaller municipalities might not have that capacity. It was very difficult to find staff that could come and do reviews and of plans and things in person, doing the inspections. You know, making sure that you have a process where you're looking at how much water actually comes into the household. Pasco County had a system where they had a portal where people could upload the pictures of what happened actually within their house. That helps make that quicker determination. Looking at, you know, can you have temporary habitability where people can continue to stay in their homes as long as they can get a couple of key things turned back on. Having one-stop shops for people to get these permits, you know, whatever you can do. And I think we're looking at how do we start that from the beginning with that initial damage assessment, that as you flag homes that are potentially major or destroyed, maybe having a door hanger or information then to help homeowners navigate this. I don't know how many of us actually ever pull permits and do substantial work to our homes in our lifetime. And imagine now, you've got tens of thousands of people all trying to do this at the same time. And in some of our cities, that might be 1 or 2 people working in an office trying to process hundreds of permits and applications at the same time. So it's a very confusing time for people. And again, the more that we can, I'm hoping that people will take advantage of Elevate Florida, look at how they can mitigate their homes, secure them as best they can. That's really going to make the difference for people being able to get back into their homes quicker after a storm.
Anyone else have anything to add to it?
Just wanted to add to really take, I think Kathy had some really wise words there, you know, take the classes, look at the information on the 1206 options for bringing in support from vendors to augment your staffing, have that conversation with your permitting offices and your public or your development and planning teams, because it is hard to wrap your brain around the fact that you're going to have to multiply by 100 what you normally do in any given month, and that's going to be that way for multiple months. So, but once they start understanding, okay, we have all this extra assessments to do, the permitting is going to increase, start talking about how you're going to incorporate that support, and it's a good time to have the conversation now versus when you're surrounded by a recovery situation.
So in the housing realm for us, we were designated a highly impacted county, just as our neighbors, but for some reason we didn't get direct housing assistance. So we had to look internal to what resources that we did have and move through the process and through the case management, as I mentioned earlier, making sure we can find a solution for folks in the transitional sheltering. One of the things we found in the TSA program, we're working with our hotel association. I recommend you all do this as well. These hotels have to be registered. They want to know, hey, how do I get paid? So we found out that we have some gaps there. So we're meeting now, and even through the process, educating these folks that's running these hotels, how they can get registered and why it's important to register so that we can help our community get back up and running so that they can get their rooms back and get folks back to work, and that's some of their employees that need to get back to work.
Are you saying you're doing that now?
We're doing that now.
So to kind of piggyback on that, we have a large audience. We haven't seen a storm yet this year. Are there maybe 1 or 2 takeaways? That sounds like one where you can do this now to be ready for a storm if it does hit during the season. Like, are there any takeaways on just getting prepared from your side of things?
Always more contracts. So we have a tremendous behavioral health contract that we bring in anytime we open shelters because it's stressful for the community coming in. It's also stressful for people that normally work in a library and now they're put in a public shelter. We also had staffing contracts to bring in additional shelter staff. I think just be prepared to ask for more things. This network is incredible. I can't say thank you enough to everybody. Not only from my team.
That came up last year too,
county
where
departments,
just the networking part of it.
Yeah, it's great that at any point in time we can text each other, or you've got people texting you like, hey, can I come, can I help you? We're probably the worst people at taking a break or taking a day off. There's no such thing as a 12-hour day, they may be 15, 18-hour days. So, having that in place, we brought Capacity PAP in. who knew that just by taking a deeper breath, that it could calm you down and slow you down. So there's just so much stuff that making sure that you're taking care of your staff and all the people that you're working with. Having those contracts in place is key. The state has done a really great job at identifying a lot of contractors. Like I said, recognizing that when you're going to be faced with something that's larger than you've ever been used to, don't be afraid to start ramping up, asking for things. We started doing a lot of pre-scripted mission requests. We had to manage over 4,000 missions, and you can imagine with 24 municipalities, if each one asks for 20 things, and then we have to turn around and put those into the state sometimes. So it's a lot, making sure that you can ramp up across all of the different areas and getting all of your departments engaged. It's not just emergency management that can do all of this. It's all hands on deck. It's every department, every city, businesses, voluntary groups. So really that networking and the meeting and the conversations that you're having now are just so key.
Sandra and Jody, is there anything you, from last year, you're going through Milton, Helene, you're like, oh, I wish we had done this early in the season, now we have to deal with it. Is there anything you're planning to do now before the season really heats up?
So we're definitely enhancing our technology within the EOC as far as our dashboards and data that we're getting and processing it and how we're looking at it. But I think one of my really big takeaways from the last season was emergency management stepped up to coordinate operations that traditionally they hadn't coordinated in the past. We go back to that level 2 and EM goes back to their kind of ish blue skies duties. But we found that having an EM coordinator coordinate the call for sand operations, coordinate calls for substantial damage assessments, and coordinating the efforts with the county departments has made a significant difference in the way that the information is flowing, the way that it's going out to different people, because like one substantial damage estimate on a house impacts my code enforcement, it impacts building and development services, permitting, inspections, and that's just one structure that is straightforward and simple. And if it's not, then it impacts everyone else. And so EM it is the king of coordinating information. And so having emergency management step up to coordinate those calls and that flow of information has really been integral to the recovery for the county.
Yeah, for us, a number of areas, but I'll focus on 2. So our logistics team, we have our general services director is here. He did a wonderful job helping us lead the logistics section. And we learned very quickly we needed a bigger warehouse and a warehouse that functioned better. It was a very old operation that we had with EM and shelter equipment up on the 2nd floor and needing a lift gate to get it down and up. And when you have multiple storms over the course of a season, it was a lot. So that piece, we have a new warehouse now going into the season, thanks to his efforts, and as well as our staging area and being able to make improvements so that we can have semi-trucks come in and easily get out. The other thing that we're working on is we have created now an EOC staffing position in our EOC that HR is helping us assist with, really helping to track shifts and making sure we have the right people in the room, and if we don't need them there overnight, that they are not being just sitting around. We're really taking a closer look on preserving our ability to utilize our employees but not drive them into the ground, and then bringing in vendor support, bringing in mutual aid teams, which we did this season, but having that point person and that team that's there to be that coordination point, I think it's going to be tremendously helpful. We got to that point in Milton, but we didn't have them earlier in the season. It made a big difference.
And that, we only have a couple of minutes left. Part of the conference is about persevering, and that's a good lead into any advice, suggestions on how to keep your staff motivated when you're dealing with multiple storms like this? When the burnout, I remember in 2004, it was a tremendous stress and it was difficult. Any suggestions on keeping staff motivated, keeping them ready to go for that next storm that's a week and a half away?
Yeah. So whenever you had the opportunity to taking that time off, I try to tell the staff, especially as we close out a season going into the new season, no new business after November. It's time to start shutting it down and getting ready to spend time with your family. And because you come back January, you're ramping back up. And we try to take that time between January and April. And again, try to get the staff out, get them out there with their family, try to get them traveling, getting away as we get ready to ramp up to the season and repeating Groundhog Day.
Kathy.
Yeah, your team is your lifeline, so love you guys. Thank you for being